6 Unseen Marks of Women with High Spiritual Power, vertical bar, Carl Jung's Hidden Wisdom. Every woman carries within her a power that the world rarely sees, not loud, not visible, but unmistakable. It is the silent gravity of a soul that has met its shadow, endured solitude, and returned whole. Carl Jung called this process individuation, the birth of the true self through the union of opposites. These are the 6 unseen marks of women whose spiritual power transcends appearance, the signs of a consciousness shaped in the depths. Part 1. The Invisible Aura. When presence speaks louder than words. There is a phenomenon that Carl Jung understood better than most psychologists of his time, the invisible force that radiates from an individual's psyche. He called it the psychic field, a kind of energetic atmosphere produced by the totality of one's inner life. Women with high spiritual power carry an especially dense and magnetic field, one that cannot be measured or explained through the 5 senses. Their presence has gravity. Without uttering a single word, they can alter the emotional temperature of a room. Others may not know why they suddenly feel calm, intimidated, or deeply moved in her presence, but what they are responding to is her integrated psyche, her union with the self. This kind of presence is not learned. It is cultivated through an inner alchemy. Jung believed that when the conscious and the unconscious begin to communicate harmoniously, a transformation takes place. The personality becomes infused with something he called numinosity, a sacred quality that evokes awe, fascination, or even fear in others. In the woman who has achieved this inner alignment, her aura reflects not only her current emotions, but the total history of her psychological evolution. Every trauma she has confronted, every shadow she has integrated, every layer of falseness she has shed, these become invisible threads woven into her energetic fabric. People sense it, even if they don't understand it. Some feel drawn toward her warmth and authenticity, while others feel exposed in her gaze as if their own masks are being stripped away. The aura of a spiritually powerful woman acts as a mirror. It amplifies truth, magnifies emotion, and exposes the dissonance between what others pretend to be and what they truly are. Jung observed that the human psyche reacts instinctively to symbols and energies that carry unconscious significance. When someone embodies archetypal energy, such as that of the healer, the priestess, or the mother, it stirs deep emotions in those around them. For example, a woman who has integrated her shadow might unconsciously awaken suppressed material in others. Someone who has avoided their own darkness might feel threatened by her calm acceptance of hers. They can't explain their discomfort, but it comes from the unconscious clash of energies. She becomes a living symbol, a projection screen for the collective unconscious. Her silence carries information. Jung once said, "The meeting of 2 personalities is like the contact of 2 chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." This is precisely what happens when such a woman enters a space. Her energy doesn't just coexist, it reacts. The collective psyche of the room shifts, slightly aligning or resisting her vibration. In a world that celebrates external noise, the stillness of her presence is revolutionary. It reminds people that true power is invisible, subtle, and rooted in self-knowledge. To understand this aura from a Jungian lens, we must explore the idea of the self. For Jung, the self is the totality of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious. It is the organizing principle of one's being, the divine center that guides psychological growth. When a person becomes aligned with their self, they emanate coherence. Every gesture, tone, and glance carries a sense of wholeness. In women with high spiritual power, this alignment is not a mask. It is authenticity embodied. Their energy flows from within rather than being borrowed from external validation. This is why such women do not need to dominate conversations or assert authority. Their power doesn't come from ego, but from integration. The ego, in Jung's view, is only the tip of the iceberg, what we consciously identify with. The rest of the iceberg, the unconscious, contains immense energy potential and wisdom. A spiritually mature woman has descended into those depths, faced the monsters that dwell there, and emerged with the treasure of self-awareness. That treasure becomes her aura. Jung often described the process of individuation as a journey toward wholeness. It requires the confrontation with the shadow, the acceptance of one's inner opposites, and the reconciliation between masculine and feminine energies. In women, this includes integrating the animus, the inner masculine principle representing logic, direction, and spiritual authority. When she unites her animus with her natural feminine intuition, she embodies equilibrium. Her energy becomes balanced, grounded, and magnetic. People sense this equilibrium immediately. Men may feel both admiration and fear, as her presence mirrors back their own unresolved anima, the feminine within them that they have not yet honored. Other women might oscillate between admiration and jealousy depending on how connected they are to their own feminine essence. Her presence disrupts illusions, not by preaching, but by simply being. She embodies what Jung called individuation, realized the state of psychological completeness that many seek but few attain. This invisible aura also has a biological and somatic dimension. Jung noted that the psyche and the body are not separate. The unconscious often communicates through physical sensations. When the psyche achieves harmony, the body follows. Women with high spiritual power often move slowly, deliberately. Their posture is relaxed yet confident. Their eyes seem to see both the outer world and the inner one. These physical traits are not consciously designed, they are the natural expressions of an integrated nervous system. When the inner world is ordered, the outer form reflects serenity. The aura, then, is the psychological field manifested through the body. It's why someone can walk into a room and everyone turns instinctively to look, not because of beauty, but because of presence. The energy is coherent. In a fragmented world, coherence feels sacred. People instinctively seek it, but this coherence has a price. The woman who carries it has walked through chaos. She has descended into confusion, grief, and shadow work. The calm that others admire is the result of storms already survived. Jung's concept of the numinous experience helps explain why such women evoke strong emotions in others. He described the numinous as that which is simultaneously fascinating and terrifying, something that transcends the rational mind. The presence of a spiritually evolved woman can trigger this feeling because she carries the energy of the transcendent. She represents the part of the psyche that has touched the divine. This is why people project holiness or mystery onto her. They sense divinity, but it's not hers alone, it's the reflection of their own higher potential, mirrored back at them. However, this aura also isolates her. Jung warned that the individuated person often feels estranged from the collective because they no longer conform to its unconscious norms. A woman who has realized her spiritual power cannot shrink back into ordinary identity. Her frequency is higher, her perception deeper. She perceives the motives and energies behind words, and thus superficial interactions exhaust her. People sense this discernment, sometimes mistaking it for coldness, but in reality it's awareness. She cannot engage in small talk when her intuition perceives the unspoken. Her aura therefore becomes both a bridge and a boundary. It invites authenticity and repels falseness. Jung would say that she has become a vessel of the self, a mediator between the conscious and the divine. Others may interpret this as charisma or mystery, but it is actually the byproduct of a psyche aligned with its center. This alignment radiates outward, creating an electromagnetic field that influences others. The field is invisible, yet it communicates volumes. If one could visualize this aura, it might look like concentric rings of light around her, shifting with emotion but never chaotic. Jung himself might have described it symbolically as the mandala, the archetype of wholeness. The mandala represents the self's order, symmetry, and inner balance. Women of high spiritual power embody this mandala energy. They don't just meditate on symbols of wholeness, they become them. Their entire being organizes around the center, and others can feel that symmetry even if they don't understand it. In Jungian depth psychology, we could say that her aura is her psychic resonance. Every individual emits psychic energy through words, tone, gaze, and intention. But when the unconscious is in turmoil, that energy is fragmented. People feel it as anxiety or inconsistency. When the unconscious is harmonized, energy flows seamlessly. This flow is what we call presence. Presence is not performance. It is the unfiltered transmission of being. There's a paradox in her energy. It feels ancient, yet fresh, gentle, yet commanding. Jung might say that she carries archetypal power, the resonance of timeless patterns embedded in the collective unconscious. Archetypes like the wise woman, the healer, or the mother live through her. When others meet her, they are meeting these ancient energies embodied. This explains why her presence evokes deep emotions that seem disproportionate to the situation. It's not personal, it's archetypal. The soul recognizes something eternal within her. Those who are disconnected from their own spiritual nature might misinterpret her quiet power as arrogance or manipulation. Jung warned that people often project their unconscious contents onto others. The aura of a spiritually powerful woman becomes a blank screen for these projections. Some will idolize her, others will demonize her, but both responses reveal their own shadow. She must therefore learn the art of psychic boundaries, holding her light without absorbing the distortions of others. The invisible aura also affects communication. Jung believed that the unconscious communicates not just through language, but through psychic contagion, the transmission of emotion and intention beneath words. A woman in deep alignment can calm a distressed person without speaking because her nervous system is regulated, her energy coherent. In contrast, someone fragmented can infect others with anxiety. The aura, therefore, is a medium of psychological exchange. In depth psychological terms, she has achieved what Jung called participation mystique in a conscious form. Primitive societies lived in participation, mystique unconsciously. They felt connected to everything but lacked self-awareness. A spiritually awakened woman, however, reclaims that connection consciously. She feels one with life, but remains aware of her individuality. This conscious unity gives her a sacred magnetism. People feel safe around her because she embodies both empathy and self-containment. Her presence also exposes falsehood effortlessly. Jung noted that truth has an energetic resonance and lies carry dissonance. The aura of an integrated psyche vibrates with truth. When a dishonest person approaches, they feel internal tension because their vibration clashes with hers. This is not magic, it's resonance physics mirrored through psychology. The psyche, like sound, operates through frequency. Coherence attracts coherence. Distortion cannot hide within harmony. From a symbolic perspective, the aura is the halo of saints, the glow of enlightenment, the light depicted around deities in ancient art. Jung interpreted such symbols not as literal lights, but as psychic realities. They represent the illumination of consciousness that occurs when the self integrates the unconscious. The saints and mystics of history, Jung would argue, were individuals who achieved psychological wholeness. Their light was the outward sign of inner unity. Similarly, the modern, spiritually powerful woman is a contemporary mystic, though she may wear ordinary clothes and live an ordinary life. Her illumination is psychological, not religious. Her relationships often reflect her energy. Because her aura is truthful, it becomes difficult for others to maintain pretense around her. People either rise to authenticity or withdraw. Jung observed that individuation demands separation from the collective's unconscious patterns. This is why such women rarely maintain large social circles. They prefer depth over number, silence over chatter, connection over performance. Their solitude is not loneliness, it's resonance alignment. Another subtle quality of this aura is compassion without sentimentality. Jung said that real compassion arises only after one has met their own darkness. Women of spiritual power have faced their inner demons, thus they can hold space for others without judgment. Their compassion has weight. It's not pity, it's presence. They can sit with pain without needing to fix it. This stillness is what others perceive as healing. It's the embodiment of the healer archetype that radiates through their field. In psychoanalytic terms, we could say that their aura acts as a holding environment, a psychological container that allows others to confront their own unconscious safely. This is similar to what happens in therapy. The patient projects their psyche onto the analyst, and through the analyst's presence, healing begins. Spiritually powerful women unconsciously create this same dynamic in daily life. Their friends, partners, or even strangers often find themselves revealing secrets or feeling emotional release in their presence. This is not coincidence. It's the unconscious seeking integration through resonance. The aura also affects time perception. People often describe losing track of time around such women. Jung called this kairos, sacred time, as opposed to chronological time. When consciousness touches the eternal linear time dissolves. Her presence opens a field where the psyche feels suspended between worlds, the mundane and the divine. The paradox is that she does not seek this power. It emerges as a byproduct of self-integration. The more she surrenders egoic striving, the more luminous she becomes. Jung emphasized that individuation cannot be forced. It unfolds naturally through confrontation with the unconscious. Thus, the aura is not decoration, it's evidence of work done in the depths. We can imagine her aura as layered. The outer layer reflects emotional tone, calm, focused, or passionate. The middle layer holds her beliefs and archetypal imprints. The core radiates the self's essence, pure awareness beyond identity. When these layers align, energy flows freely. When misaligned, dissonance appears as anxiety, confusion, or fatigue. Through dreamwork, shadow integration, and mindfulness, she maintains this alignment. Her aura, therefore, becomes not static but dynamic, a living ecosystem of consciousness. Every person she meets reacts to this field differently. The insecure may feel exposed, the authentic may feel inspired, and the wounded may feel soothed. Jung would interpret these reactions as complexes being triggered. Her energy touches dormant psychic material in others, activating their own individuation process. That's why her mere presence can catalyze growth. She doesn't teach, it happens spontaneously. The invisible aura is thus both mirror and catalyst. It reveals, it heals, and it challenges. It is the living proof that the psyche, when integrated, becomes its own form of light. Jung might say that she has become transparent to the transcendent. Her individuality no longer blocks the flow of spirit. Others experience her not as a personality but as an archetype, the bridge between the human and the divine. And yet she remains human. The aura doesn't make her perfect. It makes her real. She feels deeply, loves intensely, and occasionally struggles with the same human doubts as anyone else. But unlike most, she doesn't flee from them. She allows them to move through her, trusting that every shadow serves the light. Her aura, therefore, is not a wall of protection but a flow of surrender. To perceive such a woman is to glimpse the potential within oneself. Jung wrote that what we admire in others lies dormant within us. The magnetic presence of a spiritually powerful woman awakens that recognition. Her aura whispers, "You too are capable of this wholeness." That silent transmission is her greatest gift. Part 2. The Path of Solitude. Why spiritual women are often alone. In Jungian depth psychology, solitude is not an accident of circumstance, but a psychological necessity for individuation. For women of high spiritual power, solitude is often misunderstood by society as loneliness, withdrawal, or emotional detachment. Yet from a depth perspective, solitude is the psychic womb in which transformation occurs. It is within isolation that the self begins to communicate with consciousness, guiding the individual toward wholeness. Jung himself wrote that loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. The spiritually mature woman experiences precisely this. Her inner life becomes so vast, so symbolically charged, that ordinary interaction cannot contain it. Solitude functions as a crucible for the union between the conscious ego and the unconscious. It removes the external noise that maintains identification with social personas, the masks Jung called personae. In ordinary life, the persona serves a practical purpose. It allows us to adapt to collective norms. But when individuation begins, the soul demands authenticity. The old masks crack. The woman who once found safety in pleasing others or performing roles begins to feel alienated from them. Her solitude is therefore not chosen in bitterness but imposed by the psyche itself. The unconscious withdraws her energy from external attachments to redirect it inward toward integration. The early phase of this solitude often feels like exile. Relationships that once defined her sense of belonging begin to dissolve. Jung described this phase as enantiodromia, the natural reversal of direction within the psyche when one extreme has been lived too long. If she has lived years in service to others, suppressing her voice to maintain harmony, the psyche compensates by demanding isolation. The pendulum swings toward inner life, sometimes violently. What the world calls loss is psychologically the self reclaiming its own territory. During this period, dreams become vivid. Symbols of water, mountains, caves, or deserts often appear. These images express the unconscious experience of retreat and purification. The cave, for instance, is an archetypal image of both womb and tomb, the place where the ego dies to be reborn in a larger consciousness. Many women report a deep fatigue at this stage, as if the soul itself were pulling them into rest. Jung would interpret this as psychic regression, not in a pathological sense, but as a return to origins. The libido withdraws from external activity to reorganize the psyche internally. It is through this regression that the woman begins to hear the faint voice of the self. This voice is subtle, non-verbal, and often comes through intuition or synchronicities. External society may perceive her as detached or uninterested, yet inwardly she is undergoing profound dialogue with the unconscious. In Jung's terms, she is moving from the stage of ego dominance to self-orientation. The ego, which once directed her life according to collective expectations, now becomes a servant to something deeper. But this solitude is rarely peaceful at first. The psyche, when deprived of external distractions, reveals its own chaos. Repressed emotions, forgotten memories, and unmet desires rise from the shadow. Jung warned that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. The spiritual woman in solitude must confront her inner multiplicity, the fragments of self she disowned, to fit into the collective. She faces the shadow, the reservoir of instincts, fears, and projections that she has denied. Often this confrontation manifests as an existential crisis. She questions her identity, her beliefs, even her purpose. This is the nigredo phase of alchemy, the dark night of transformation where the old personality decomposes. Many women mistake this darkness for failure, but from a depth perspective, it is a sacred dismemberment. The disintegration of the old self allows the emergence of new psychic structures. Jung compared this process to the mythical descent of Inanna, the Sumerian goddess, who journeyed into the underworld, stripped of her ornaments and garments. Likewise, the spiritually powerful woman descends alone, shedding social roles, attachments, and illusions. Each loss exposes another layer of truth. Her solitude becomes her initiation. This inner journey often leads her away from collective consciousness. Jung noted that individuation separates one from the herd. The more individuated a person becomes, the less they can participate in mass-mindedness. For women, this separation can be especially painful, as cultural conditioning teaches them to define themselves through relationship and care for others. But individuation demands a temporary withdrawal from these archetypal patterns. The mother archetype must be balanced by the wise woman or crone, whose focus turns inward toward wisdom rather than nurturing. This transition requires solitude. The psyche cannot birth wisdom amidst constant external noise. Jung's concept of inner necessity explains why many spiritually powerful women do not choose solitude, it chooses them. The self orchestrates circumstances that strip away distraction. Relationships end careers. Shift or illness forces rest. From an outer perspective, it may appear as bad luck, but psychologically it is destiny at work. The self ensures that the woman has no choice but to confront herself. In alchemical symbolism, this is the stage of calcinatio, the burning away of impurities. Everything non-essential is consumed by inner fire. In this fire, she discovers silence. At first, the silence feels unbearable. The ego resists emptiness because it equates activity with existence. But Jung insisted that silence is the medium of the unconscious. In silence, the symbols begin to speak. The woman starts noticing synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that reveal hidden order. The self communicates through these events, guiding her toward integration. As she learns to trust this inner dialogue, her fear of solitude transforms into reverence. She realizes that what she mistook for isolation is communion, the psyche communing with its source. The transformation of solitude into sacred space is one of the most defining traits of women with high spiritual power. They cease to perceive aloneness as deprivation and begin to experience it as abundance. Jung described the self as an inner companion, the divine presence that never abandons. In solitude, she becomes aware of this companion. The loneliness dissolves not because she finds external company, but because she realizes she was never truly alone. This realization marks the birth of inner autonomy. Her emotional stability no longer depends on external validation. It rests on her union with the self. This inner autonomy radiates outward. The more she aligns with herself, the more her energy field stabilizes. People begin to notice her serenity, her unshakable calm. Yet paradoxically, the more luminous she becomes, the more she is misunderstood. Jung explained that individuation alienates the individual from collective norms. The spiritually evolved woman becomes strange in the eyes of others because she no longer plays the same psychological games. She doesn't gossip, compete, or seek approval. Her detachment threatens those still bound to the collective unconscious. They may label her as distant or proud, not realizing that she has simply transcended the need for constant external stimulation. Her solitude, therefore, functions as both protection and purification. Jung observed that psychic contamination occurs when individuals unconsciously absorb collective emotions. A woman who has opened her unconscious channels is particularly sensitive to this. Without solitude, she would drown in psychic noise. Solitude allows her to discharge external energies and restore equilibrium. It is, in a sense, psychological hygiene. In this solitude, she also encounters the archetype of the hermit or wise old man-woman. This archetype represents the guiding wisdom of the self. Through dreams, meditation, or sudden insights, she begins receiving guidance that feels ancient and impersonal. Jung saw such experiences as manifestations of the transcendent function, the bridge between consciousness and the unconscious. The transcendent function emerges when opposites are held in tension. In solitude, she becomes capable of sustaining that tension between fear and faith, darkness and light, ego and self. This capacity to contain paradox is what gives her depth. The psychological meaning of solitude thus shifts from emptiness to fullness. The woman's inner world becomes populated with symbols, archetypes, and insights. Her imagination ceases to be fantasy and becomes revelation. Jung believed that imagination is the organ of the soul. In solitude, this organ awakens. She begins to dialogue with her inner figures, the anima, the shadow, the child, the wise one. These dialogues are not delusions, but the psyche's natural method of self-communication. Through them, she learns emotional integration. Every rejected part of herself finds a voice. Gradually, her inner conflicts transform into harmony. There is, however, a danger in prolonged isolation, the inflation of the ego through identification with the archetypal. Jung warned that when individuals access transpersonal energies, they risk mistaking themselves for divine beings. The spiritually powerful woman must maintain humility, recognizing that the energy moving through her belongs to the self, not the ego. True solitude cultivates this humility because it continuously reminds her of her smallness before the vastness of the psyche. She becomes both participant and witness, a vessel through which the unconscious manifests, but never its master. As her solitude deepens, her perception of time and space changes. Jung noted that the unconscious operates in kairos, qualitative, not chronological time. Hours in solitude can feel like moments, or a single day can unfold with symbolic intensity equivalent to years of experience. The woman begins to live in rhythm with psychological time rather than social schedules. She senses when to act and when to rest, guided by inner seasons. This attunement to psychic rhythm enhances her intuitive intelligence. She becomes aligned not with human clocks, but with cosmic cycles. Her solitude also refines discernment. In silence, the noise of collective values fades, allowing her to distinguish between authentic desire and social conditioning. Jung taught that neurosis often arises when people live values that do not belong to their own nature. The spiritually awakened woman through solitude begins to unlearn these borrowed values. She rediscovers what is truly hers, her passions, her instincts, her truths. This process can lead to radical life changes, leaving a career, ending a marriage, moving to nature, or embracing creative callings. Each change reflects the soul's reclamation of authenticity. The paradox remains that although solitude isolates her physically, it connects her spiritually to everything. Jung spoke of the unus mundus, the unified world underlying all dualities. When the woman's consciousness aligns with the self, she perceives this unity. Trees, rivers, and strangers all mirror aspects of her psyche. This mystical awareness does not come through effort, but through surrender. Solitude becomes her teacher, nature her temple, and silence her scripture. Such a woman may appear detached from worldly ambitions, but she is not apathetic. Her detachment stems from a shift in orientation from outer achievement to inner realization. Jung believed that psychological maturity involves the transition from the first half of life, ego building, to the second half, self-realization. In solitude, she crosses this threshold. The energies once invested in pleasing, proving, or competing are redirected toward meaning. Her solitude, therefore, is not anti-social, it is trans-social. She serves the collective by becoming more whole, and through her wholeness she radiates healing into the unconscious of humanity. Her dreams during this phase often show guiding figures or circular symbols. The circle or mandala represents psychic totality. When she dreams of circles, temples, or light surrounding her, the unconscious is affirming progress toward wholeness. Jung himself recorded such dreams during his own midlife solitude at Bollingen Tower. He understood that the psyche seeks self-expression through structure and symbol. The woman's solitude allows these symbols to emerge, unfiltered by social interference. Each image, each dream becomes a step in her individuation. The experience of solitude eventually transforms her relationship with others. She no longer seeks company to avoid herself, but chooses it consciously when it resonates with her essence. Jung differentiated between attachment and relatedness. Attachment arises from need, relatedness arises from wholeness. In solitude, she learns relatedness. When she interacts with others, her presence nourishes rather than drains. She no longer gives to be loved, but loves because her being overflows. Her relationships become alchemical vessels, spaces of mutual transformation rather than dependence. It is crucial to note that not all who are alone are spiritually evolved. Solitude becomes transformative only when it is inhabited consciously. Jung emphasized that awareness turns fate into choice. The woman who embraces solitude with consciousness turns her isolation into initiation. Those who resist it remain trapped in victimhood. Thus, the difference lies not in the outer condition, but in the inner attitude. Conscious solitude is gold. Unconscious isolation is lead. The alchemy of the soul lies in transmuting one into the other. Her eventual emergence from solitude carries the quality of rebirth. Jung compared individuation to the mythical motif of death and resurrection. The woman returns to the world, but she is not the same. Her speech is slower, her gaze deeper, her energy more grounded. She has touched eternity and carries its residue. Others sense it and respond with reverence or resistance. Her solitude has carved depth into her being, giving her a gravity that words cannot explain. This gravity is her spiritual signature. It is the fruit of years of inner gestation. Without solitude, this depth could not have formed. Just as the seed must rest in darkness before sprouting, the soul must dwell in silence before flowering. Jung's insight remains timeless. Only in solitude can one meet the self. For women of high spiritual power, that meeting is destiny, and their aloneness is not a wound but a calling. Part 3. The shadow integration, facing the dark feminine within. In the framework of Jungian depth psychology, the shadow represents the totality of the unconscious contents that the ego does not recognize or accept. It is the dark side of the personality, not because it is inherently evil, but because it remains unseen and unintegrated. Jung described the shadow as that which the conscious ego refuses to identify with, yet which constantly influences behavior, emotion, and projection. For women of high spiritual power, the integration of this shadow is not merely a moral task, it is the axis upon which their individuation process turns. Without confronting the shadow, spiritual power remains fragmented, contaminated by unconscious complexes and repressed impulses. The shadow in a woman's psyche includes both personal and collective dimensions. The personal shadow consists of individual traits, emotions, and instincts that her conscious personality disowns: anger, envy, sensuality, ambition, or aggression. The collective shadow contains cultural and archetypal material patterns inherited through the collective unconscious, such as fear of autonomy, repression of sexuality, or internalized inferiority. Jung noted that the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. For the spiritually advanced woman, this effort becomes her initiation into authenticity. The shadow cannot be integrated through denial or suppression. It must be faced directly, acknowledged, and reconciled. Jung emphasized that integration requires holding the tension of opposites. The conscious mind must neither identify with nor reject the shadow, but relate to it symbolically. When a woman acknowledges her shadow impulses without acting them out destructively, she begins the alchemical process of transformation. Her energy, once split between opposing psychic poles, becomes unified. This unification marks the birth of psychological wholeness. The dark, feminine aspect of the psyche refers to the instinctual, embodied, and emotionally intense side of womanhood that Western culture has often rejected. Jung observed that patriarchal conditioning encouraged women to embody the light qualities of nurturing passivity and virtue, while banishing assertiveness, sexuality, and independence into the unconscious. The result is a psychic imbalance. The ego identifies with an idealized good woman image, while the disowned instincts form a shadow that seeks expression through symptoms, anxiety, depression, or projections. Integration of the shadow feminine, therefore, involves reclaiming what was denied: the full range of emotional and instinctual life. The process begins with projection. Jung explained that individuals encounter their shadow primarily through others. What we condemn, fear, or overreact to in others often reflects aspects of ourselves that remain unconscious. For a woman, this might manifest as jealousy toward another woman's confidence, anger at male authority, or judgment of someone's emotional intensity. If she is psychologically observant, she will recognize that the emotion she projects outward reveals a disowned inner quality. When she withdraws these projections, the shadow begins to surface. Integration becomes possible only when she stops moralizing and starts observing. This confrontation is rarely comfortable. The shadow speaks in the language of emotion and impulse. It reveals what the ego most fears: contradiction and ambiguity. The spiritually mature woman must tolerate the inner conflict between who she believes she is and what she actually contains. Jung called this process shadow confrontation and warned that it often produces disorientation, guilt, or even shame. Yet it is precisely through this discomfort that the ego expands. The energy bound up in repression is released, granting her access to new vitality and creativity. In Jungian psychology, the integration of the shadow is inseparable from the process of individuation, the journey toward becoming a whole, unified personality. Individuation requires the reconciliation of opposites within the psyche, light and dark, masculine and feminine, rational and instinctual. When these opposites are split, psychic energy stagnates. When they are integrated, energy flows freely. For the spiritually evolved woman, this integration is particularly critical because her intuitive and empathic capacities make her more susceptible to inflation or psychic overwhelm if the shadow remains unacknowledged. The unintegrated shadow leaks through unconscious identification with goodness, martyrdom, or superiority. Jung warned that the brighter the conscious light, the darker the corresponding shadow. Spiritual women must therefore cultivate humility as a safeguard against unconscious inflation. To integrate the shadow requires not moral purification but psychological understanding. The ego must learn to differentiate between possession by shadow contents and relationship to them. Possession occurs when unconscious impulses take over behavior, resulting in projection, addiction, or compulsion. Relationship occurs when the ego acknowledges these impulses as part of itself, but maintains conscious reflection. This distinction transforms instinct into insight. The woman who can reflect on her anger without being consumed by it gains psychological freedom. Her energy becomes available for creativity rather than conflict. Jung often used alchemical symbolism to describe this process. The nigredo phase, the blackening, represents the encounter with shadow material. In this stage, the psyche experiences confusion, despair, and fragmentation. The ego feels overwhelmed by the unconscious. Yet this descent is necessary. It dissolves rigid identifications and prepares the ground for renewal. The woman's encounter with her own aggression, jealousy, or desire shatters the illusion of moral perfection. Only through accepting her imperfection does she gain genuine humility. Jung believed that the capacity to hold imperfection consciously is the foundation of individuation. From a psychological standpoint, shadow integration also involves the reconciliation of instinct and spirit. Western thought has often elevated spirit, while devaluing instinct, creating a dualism that splits the psyche. Jung sought to heal this division. He argued that instinct and spirit are complementary expressions of the same life energy, libido. When a woman represses her instincts, her spirituality becomes abstract, disconnected from lived experience. Conversely, when she denies her spiritual dimension, she becomes driven by compulsion. Integration unites the two, allowing her spirituality to become embodied and her instincts to become conscious. The encounter with the shadow feminine thus restores the sacredness of the body. Jung emphasized that the psyche is not merely mental, it is psychoid, interwoven with somatic reality. Unintegrated shadow contents manifest physically as tension, illness, or fatigue. As the woman confronts her disowned emotions, the body begins to release stored energy. The process may involve grief, anger, or spontaneous tears. These are not signs of weakness, but of psychic detoxification. The unconscious, once acknowledged, ceases to sabotage from beneath and begins to cooperate with consciousness. The integration of the shadow also requires awareness of the anima-animus dynamic. While Jung primarily applied the term anima to the feminine aspect in men and animus to the masculine aspect in women, he acknowledged that each individual contains both principles. For women, the animus often represents the inner logos, reason, assertiveness, and spiritual authority. When the shadow remains unintegrated, the animus becomes negative, manifesting as internal criticism, rigidity, or judgment. As she integrates the shadow, the animus transforms into a guide rather than a tyrant. It helps her articulate her truth with clarity rather than aggression. Her thinking becomes infused with emotional intelligence. This inner transformation alters her outer relationships. Jung explained that what is unconscious within us is lived through others. Before integration, the woman may attract partners who embody her disowned shadow-controlling, manipulative, or emotionally unavailable men who mirror her own repressed power. Through projection, she unconsciously externalizes her inner conflict. When she begins integrating her shadow, these patterns dissolve. She no longer seeks completion through another, because she has begun the internal marriage of opposites. The conjunctio, or sacred union, occurs within. Shadow integration is not a single event, but a lifelong dialogue. Jung insisted that the unconscious is inexhaustible. New layers of shadow continue to emerge as consciousness expands. Each stage of awareness reveals deeper strata of the psyche. For women of high spiritual development, this means that their evolution never ceases. As they gain more light, they must integrate more darkness. The process becomes circular, not linear, each descent into the unconscious, followed by a greater ascent into clarity. Psychologically, this ongoing integration strengthens the ego, self-axis, the line of communication between consciousness and the self. A strong ego self-axis allows the woman to experience archetypal energies without being overwhelmed. She can channel intuition, creativity, and insight without losing grounding. This balance is the mark of true spiritual maturity. Jung wrote that the self is not only the center but also the whole circumference which embraces both conscious and unconscious. It is the center of this totality. Through shadow integration, the woman becomes aware of this totality, no longer identifying solely with her conscious ideals. The implications of this integration extend beyond personal healing. Jung believed that individual consciousness contributes to the collective unconscious. When a woman integrates her shadow, she not only liberates her own psyche but also transforms collective patterns. Her acceptance of emotional honesty challenges the cultural repression of feminine instinct. Her wholeness radiates outward, creating what Jung called a healing field in the collective psyche. Thus, shadow work becomes a form of service. However, the journey is not without peril. Jung warned of two major dangers: repression and inflation. Repression occurs when the ego refuses to face the shadow, resulting in neurosis or projection. Inflation occurs when the ego identifies with the shadow or with archetypal power, leading to grandiosity. The task is to hold the middle ground, conscious relationship, without identification. This requires discipline, self-reflection, and often solitude. The spiritually powerful woman learns to remain the observer of her inner life, witnessing without judgment. One of the paradoxes of shadow integration is that by embracing darkness, the psyche becomes lighter. Jung observed that energy trapped in repression becomes available once acknowledged. A woman who admits her envy discovers her ambition. One who accepts her anger finds her boundary. One who faces her vulnerability discovers compassion. Integration transforms destructive impulses into creative capacities. The same energy that once sabotaged her relationships becomes the force that empowers her authenticity. Dreams play a crucial role in this process. Jung viewed dreams as direct expressions of the unconscious, compensating for one-sidedness in consciousness. When the shadow is being integrated, dreams often contain images of confrontation, animals, strangers, or figures representing aggression. These figures are not threats but invitations to relationship. The woman who dialogues with these images through active imagination learns the symbolic language of her own psyche. Jung used active imagination as a method of engaging the unconscious, directly allowing images to unfold and responding consciously. Through this dialogue, she transforms the autonomous complex into a partner in growth. Emotionally, the integration of the shadow produces depth and empathy. Having faced her own darkness, the woman ceases to moralize others' struggles. She understands the universality of conflict and projection. Jung believed that compassion arises from consciousness of one's own shadow. Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. This compassion, however, is not sentimentality. It is grounded, realistic, and clear-eyed. She can hold others' pain without rescuing them because she recognizes that each soul must confront its own shadow for individuation to occur. In relationships, her presence becomes transformative. Those who meet her feel simultaneously seen and unsettled because her integrated energy exposes what others hide. This effect is not intentional. It is the natural radiation of wholeness. Jung describes such individuals as carriers of the collective unconscious. Their mere existence constellates psychic material in others. Thus, the spiritually evolved woman becomes a catalyst for others' shadow work. She provokes projection not to harm but to awaken. Those who reject her may be rejecting their own disowned aspects. From a clinical perspective, Jungian analysts note that shadow integration enhances vitality. Patients who engage this work report increased creativity, authenticity, and peace. For women in particular, reclaiming the shadow restores their instinctual authority. They begin to trust their intuition, express their truth, and embody boundaries without guilt. The repression of aggression transforms into assertive clarity. The denial of desire becomes passion. The avoidance of conflict turns into integrity. Psychologically, this represents the movement from unconscious compulsion to conscious choice. The integrated shadow also refines moral awareness. Jung distinguished between conventional morality, which depends on external rules, and individual ethics, which arises from inner dialogue with the self. The spiritually evolved woman no longer acts out of fear of judgment, but out of alignment with her inner truth. Her actions are guided by conscience rather than conformity. This inner ethical compass is more demanding than social morality because it requires constant self-observation. Shadow integration therefore produces not moral superiority, but moral responsibility. Physiologically, integration brings balance to the nervous system. Jung anticipated what modern neuroscience now affirms, that emotional repression creates stress patterns in the body. As the woman accepts her feelings, her body relaxes. Breath deepens, posture opens, and energy flows freely. This somatic harmony reflects psychological harmony. The psyche and soma are two expressions of the same underlying life energy. Ultimately, facing the dark feminine within means relinquishing the illusion of purity. Jung argued that wholeness, not goodness, is the goal of psychological development. The spiritually mature woman understands that light and darkness coexist within every soul. Her task is not to eradicate darkness, but to integrate it consciously, transforming instinct into awareness. She embodies what Jung called the coincidentia oppositorum, the union of opposites. Her being becomes a living symbol of psychological totality. This integration reshapes her spirituality. It becomes grounded, embodied, and free from dualistic thinking. She no longer seeks transcendence by escaping the human condition, but by inhabiting it fully. Jung saw this as the essence of individuation, the reconciliation of heaven and earth within the individual. For the woman who integrates her shadow, the sacred is no longer out there. It lives within her ordinary emotions, her body, her relationships. The divine speaks through imperfection, and the dark becomes luminous. In the language of depth psychology, she has achieved psychological transparency. The ego no longer blocks the flow of the self. It becomes its conscious instrument. Her words, actions, and presence align with the totality of her being. The energy once scattered in repression now flows coherently, forming the magnetic field that others experience as her aura. This is the invisible authority of authenticity, power without domination, clarity without rigidity, compassion without weakness. Her integration does not end suffering but transforms its meaning. Jung wrote that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. Yet, suffering once understood symbolically becomes sacrifice, the offering of ego illusion to the greater self. The spiritually powerful woman accepts this as the rhythm of her existence. Each descent into shadow deepens her humanity. Each emergence expands her divinity. Through her, the unconscious finds voice, and consciousness finds depth. Part 4. The gift of intuition, when the soul knows before the mind. In Jung's Analytical Psychology, intuition. Intuition is one of the 4 fundamental psychological functions, along with thinking, feeling, and sensation. It is the function by which the psyche perceives possibilities, patterns, and meanings that are not accessible to the rational or sensory faculties. Jung defined intuition as perception via the unconscious. It apprehends what is not yet manifest, what is latent within the psychic field. For women of high spiritual development, this function tends to be dominant or highly differentiated. Their intuitive faculty allows them to perceive psychological realities before they are consciously articulated, to grasp the essence of situations beyond their surface appearances, and to sense the unfolding of destiny as it moves through both the personal and collective unconscious. Jung's typology does not treat intuition as mystical or supernatural. It is an ordinary yet subtle mode of perception that arises from the psyche's autonomous intelligence. Whereas sensation tells us what exists in the present moment, intuition tells us what is coming into being. It is oriented toward potential rather than actuality. Jung observed that intuition is a kind of perception that goes via the unconscious, in contrast to sensation, which goes via the conscious sense organs. Thus, intuition is the psyche's way of reading symbolic data from the deeper strata of the unconscious. In highly developed individuals, this data manifests as insight, foresight, or spontaneous understanding without prior reasoning. In women with high spiritual power, intuition functions not merely as an auxiliary faculty, but as the organizing principle of their consciousness. Because their psychic energy is inwardly directed toward the self, they are more attuned to the unconscious field from which intuition arises. Jung noted that intuition often accompanies introversion, as introverted types draw energy from the inner world of images and possibilities. For the spiritually attuned woman, this interior orientation becomes her compass. She does not analyze situations purely through logic or emotion. She senses their hidden structure. Her awareness penetrates beneath phenomena to the archetypal patterns animating them. The intuitive function is closely linked with the transcendent function, Jung's term, for the process by which the conscious and unconscious communicate to produce a new level of psychic synthesis. Intuition is often the first manifestation of this dialogue. When the unconscious seeks to compensate for a one-sided conscious attitude, it sends signals, images, moods, hunches that appear as intuitive impressions. The woman sensitive to these impressions acts as mediator between the two realms of psyche. Her task is to interpret the intuitive message symbolically without collapsing it into literal prediction or superstition. Jung warned that intuition, if not balanced by rational discrimination, can lead to fantasy or inflation. True intuition arises from a stable ego, self-relationship, not from psychic possession. The psychological mechanism of intuition operates through the symbolic function of the unconscious. Symbols in Jung's sense are not allegories but living expressions of psychic energy. They point beyond themselves to unknown realities. When a woman experiences an intuitive knowing, she is responding to the activation of a symbol within her unconscious field. The symbol connects the personal psyche with the collective unconscious, revealing a possibility that transcends individual experience. This is why intuition often feels impersonal, as if the insight arrived rather than was produced. The self, through intuition, communicates its intention for psychic development. From the standpoint of typology, intuition can be either extroverted or introverted. Extroverted intuition perceives possibilities in the external world. It reads trends, potentials, and emerging patterns in people or situations. Introverted intuition, in contrast, perceives the archetypal images of the inner world. It apprehends the psychic background of events and their symbolic meaning. Spiritually mature women often exhibit a predominance of introverted intuition, which grants them deep insight into psychological and spiritual dynamics. They perceive the invisible forces shaping outer reality and respond to inner promptings that appear irrational to others. Jung himself described introverted intuition as visionary, the faculty that perceives images which in the future will make themselves manifest. The development of intuition, however, requires psychological discipline. Jung emphasized that every function has its inferior counterpart. When intuition is dominant, sensation becomes inferior, thus the intuitive type risks neglecting concrete reality. The woman whose perception is primarily intuitive must ground her insights in empirical experience to avoid abstraction or detachment. The integration of sensation balances the intuitive faculty, anchoring intuition in the body and in practical life. Without this balance, intuition becomes fantasy detached from actuality. Jung's model insists that psychic wholeness arises only through the differentiation and integration of all four functions, not through the exaltation of one. In the process of individuation, intuition serves as the guide toward the self. It perceives the direction of growth before the conscious ego understands it. Jung observed that the self often communicates through dreams, synchronicities, or subtle impressions that guide the individual toward transformation. Intuition acts as the receptor of these communications. The spiritually evolved woman learns to trust this faculty through experience. She discovers that her intuitive insights, when examined and verified, consistently align with deeper truth. Yet this trust must remain humble, recognizing that intuition, like all psychological functions, is fallible and colored by personal complexes. Jung's ethical imperative for the intuitive individual was self-critique to test every insight against both inner feeling and outer reality. Intuition also mediates the relationship between consciousness and the archetypes. Archetypes, as Jung defined them, are innate organizing principles of the psyche, patterns that shape perception and behavior. Because they originate beyond the personal psyche, they cannot be known directly. Intuition perceives their influence indirectly through images, symbols, and affective tones. When a woman senses that a situation carries archetypal weight, for example, the feeling of destiny in a relationship or vocation, she is responding to the activation of an archetype. Intuition enables her to navigate these energies consciously, rather than being overwhelmed by them. The intuitive function is therefore essential for integrating the unconscious. Thinking analyzes feeling, evaluates sensation, registers facts, but only intuition can perceive the potential inherent in unconscious material. Jung noted that the unconscious is not merely a repository of past experiences, but a source of future development. Intuition opens the psyche to this prospective function, allowing the woman to align her life with the teleological movement of the self. This forward orientation distinguishes Jung's psychology from Freud's retrospective model. Whereas Freud sought the causes of neurosis in childhood, Jung sought the meaning of symptoms in the individual's unrealized potential. Intuition perceives this potential before it becomes actual. For women of high spiritual power, intuition often manifests as a deep sense of timing and alignment. They act not according to external pressure, but according to inner necessity. Jung referred to this phenomenon as synchronicity, the meaningful coincidence between inner states and outer events. Intuition perceives the field in which synchronicities occur. It recognizes when the psyche and the world mirror each other. The intuitive woman therefore lives in harmony with what Jung called the Tao of the psyche, the spontaneous unfolding of order through the unity of opposites. Her life appears guided not because she controls it, but because she perceives the underlying pattern. The danger inherent in intuition lies in its invisibility. Because its operations cannot be rationally demonstrated, society often devalues or pathologizes it, particularly in women. Jung observed that Western culture privileges the thinking function, equating rationality with superiority. As a result, intuitive perception has been dismissed as irrational or emotional, though it is neither. Intuition is a form of intelligence that transcends linear logic. For women whose spiritual power depends on intuitive awareness, cultural devaluation can lead to self-doubt or suppression of this faculty. Individuation requires reclaiming it, consciously validating intuition as a legitimate cognitive process. Jung's clinical observations showed that intuition develops most fully in those who have confronted the unconscious directly. Dreams, active imagination, and symbolic reflection strengthen the connection between ego and unconscious, refining intuitive accuracy. The woman who engages her dreams learns the language of the unconscious. Intuition becomes the spontaneous understanding of that language in waking life. The more she differentiates her intuition from wishful thinking or projection, the more reliable it becomes. Jung emphasized discernment. Intuition must be verified by feeling and confirmed by reality. True intuition aligns with the self's direction, not the ego's desire. Psychologically, intuition represents the psyche's capacity for total perception, awareness of patterns that encompass both conscious and unconscious elements. Jung compared it to the function of a compass that orients the ego within the vast landscape of the psyche. Without intuition, the ego becomes trapped in literalism, mistaking surface reality for totality. The intuitive woman, by contrast, perceives the invisible dimension underlying events. Her insights may appear prophetic, but they are simply the psyche's natural capacity to perceive wholeness before it is manifest. In the dynamic of psychic development, intuition also plays a compensatory role. When thinking becomes overly dominant, intuition compensates by presenting irrational insights that challenge the intellect. When feeling becomes sentimental or subjective, intuition restores objectivity by revealing transpersonal meaning. Jung emphasized that the psyche strives for balance through compensation. Intuition is one of the means by which this self-regulation occurs. For example, a woman caught in emotional turmoil may suddenly know what to do without reasoning it out. This knowing is the psyche's spontaneous correction of imbalance. Intuition also interacts intimately with the feeling function. Whereas feeling evaluates the value of an experience, intuition perceives its potential meaning. Jung noted that these two functions often cooperate in spiritually oriented individuals. The woman of high spiritual power does not rely on intuition alone. She feels its moral weight. Her intuition is not curiosity but vocation. It carries ethical and existential implications. This integration distinguishes mature intuition from mere impulsiveness. The phenomenology of intuition reveals its autonomy. Jung recounted numerous instances where patients experienced intuitive insights that proved accurate, yet were inaccessible to their conscious knowledge. He concluded that the unconscious possesses a superior intelligence that transcends individual awareness. Intuition is the organ through which this intelligence expresses itself. It operates holistically, synthesizing information from both the personal and collective psyche. The intuitive woman therefore becomes a vessel of this larger mind. Her insights do not originate from ego but from participation in the objective psyche. In therapeutic practice, Jung valued intuition as the analyst's primary tool. Interpretation requires not only theoretical knowledge, but the capacity to sense what the unconscious is attempting to express. Similarly, the spiritually evolved woman functions as an analyst of life itself. Her intuition reads situations symbolically, perceiving the unconscious dynamics at play. This faculty grants her an almost diagnostic vision of human behavior, not judgmental but penetrating. Jung described such perception as seeing through a capacity to perceive the archetypal background behind personal phenomena. Intuition, however, demands containment. Because it operates beyond rationality, it can easily overwhelm the ego with possibilities. The intuitive woman must cultivate boundaries to prevent diffusion of energy. Jung likened this containment to the alchemical vessel in which transformation occurs. Without a stable container, the disciplined ego, the intuitive influx leads to chaos or inflation. Therefore, spiritual women must practice discernment and structure, translating intuition into grounded action. This integration of insight and discipline characterizes mature individuation. Another critical aspect of intuition in Jungian theory is its relationship to time. Intuition transcends chronological sequence. It apprehends the potential future as if it were present. Jung referred to this as the prospective function of the unconscious. The psyche anticipates developments and presents them symbolically before they unfold. For the intuitive individual, dreams or spontaneous insights often foreshadow future events or psychological transitions. These premonitory experiences are not supernatural predictions but expressions of the psyche's teleological orientation, the drive toward wholeness. The self knows the pattern and intuition receives this knowledge. This prospective capacity gives the spiritually powerful woman a sense of destiny. She perceives her life not as random but as meaningful sequence. Jung asserted that meaning is the essential need of the human soul. The least of things with a meaning is worth more in life than the greatest of things without it. Intuition reveals meaning where the rational mind sees only coincidence. It allows her to trust the unfolding of life, perceiving synchronicities as communications from the self rather than accidents. Her faith, therefore, is not blind belief, but intuitive alignment with the psyche's inherent order. From a developmental perspective, intuition matures through differentiation from fantasy. In early stages, intuitive impressions are mixed with personal desires and fears. The woman may misinterpret projections as insights. Through self-observation and integration of shadow, she learns to distinguish authentic intuition, impersonal calm, clear from pseudo-intuition, emotional self-serving or grandiose. Jung emphasized that the criterion of true intuition is its objectivity. It serves the self's growth, not the ego's inflation. The intuitive message carries a numinous quality, quiet certainty without pride. In cultural terms, Jung viewed intuition as the function through which humanity reconnects with the unconscious wisdom lost through rationalism. He lamented that modern civilization had overvalued intellect at the expense of symbolic awareness. The spiritually evolved woman, by honoring intuition, restores balance to the collective psyche. Her way of knowing exemplifies what Jung called the feminine principle of consciousness, a mode of understanding that values wholeness, connection, and meaning, rather than analysis and control. This principle is not limited to gender, but represents the anima's contribution to the evolution of consciousness. Psychologically, intuition bridges the personal and transpersonal. It enables the ego to participate in the life of the self without dissolution. Through intuition, the woman experiences moments of numinosity, direct contact with the archetypal realm. These moments may occur spontaneously during creative work, contemplation, or relationship. They bring a sense of awe and inevitability, as if something larger were moving through her. Jung interpreted such experiences as evidence of the self's autonomy. The task is not to cling to them, but to integrate their meaning into daily life. The final role of intuition in individuation is guidance. Jung wrote that the self acts as an inner compass, directing the individual toward realization of the total personality. Intuition is the instrument through which this guidance is perceived. It operates silently, often in the form of a feeling of rightness or wrongness, attraction or resistance. The spiritually evolved woman learns to listen to this subtle voice, recognizing that it speaks not from emotion but from the depths of being. To follow intuition in Jungian terms is to follow the path of individuation, the unique unfolding of one's pattern of wholeness. In sum, intuition, as defined by Jung, is the psyche's organ of meaning. It perceives the invisible order connecting inner and outer events, past and future, conscious and unconscious. For women of high spiritual power, this gift becomes both vocation and responsibility. It requires the discipline of reflection, the balance of sensation, and the humility of service to the self. When integrated intuition transforms perception into participation, the woman no longer observes life from outside but experiences herself as part of its unfolding intelligence. Through intuition, the soul indeed knows before the mind. Part 5. The wounded healer archetype. Turning pain into power. In Jungian depth psychology, the archetype of the wounded healer embodies the paradox that psychological and spiritual healing arises through the experience of one's own suffering. Jung did not invent the term, but he gave it profound psychological meaning. For him, the healer's capacity to heal is directly proportional to their capacity to suffer consciously. The wound functions not as an obstacle, but as an opening through which the self, the organizing principle of the psyche, enters the ego. In the dynamic of individuation, pain becomes the medium of transformation. It breaks the ego's defensive autonomy and forces the individual into dialogue with the unconscious. Jung saw this archetype reflected in the figure of Chiron, the mythological centaur wounded by an incurable arrow. Despite his own pain, Chiron became the teacher of healing arts. This myth for Jung symbolizes a psychic truth. The healer's own wound is the source of empathy and insight. It is our own hurt that gives the measure of our capacity to heal, he wrote in essence. The archetype reveals that suffering, when integrated, connects the individual to the collective suffering of humanity, transforming personal trauma into universal compassion. Psychologically, the wounded healer represents the individuation of the healing function within the psyche. In every individual, there exists an archetypal image of the healer, a figure that mediates between the conscious ego and the unconscious. When this archetype is constellated, the individual becomes aware of the capacity for healing not as a personal achievement but as an expression of the self. However, this healing potential is activated only through confrontation with the wound, the point of psychic rupture where consciousness encounters its limits. Jung understood that the wound breaks the illusion of ego omnipotence, compelling the individual to acknowledge dependence on the transpersonal source of meaning. The wound, in Jungian terms, signifies the experience of psychic dissociation. It marks the site where the ego has been overwhelmed by unconscious forces, trauma loss, or conflict that could not be integrated at the time of occurrence. These unassimilated experiences form complexes, autonomous clusters of emotion and memory that operate independently within the psyche. The healing process involves the gradual reintegration of these complexes through consciousness. The healer archetype becomes active precisely at this juncture, guiding the ego to re-establish relationship with the split-off material. Jung described this as the transcendent function which arises from the tension between opposites and produces a new unifying symbol. For women of high spiritual power, the wounded healer archetype manifests as the capacity to transmute personal pain into insight that benefits others. Their suffering, often rooted in early experiences of emotional neglect, betrayal, or existential alienation, awakens an acute sensitivity to the unconscious processes of others. Jung observed that only the wounded physician heals effectively because empathy is not intellectual but experiential. The healer recognizes another's pain as a reflection of her own. Yet this resonance is only therapeutic when mediated by consciousness. Without reflection, it leads to identification and emotional contagion. The analytic relationship, which Jung considered the paradigm of healing, illustrates this dynamic. The analyst's own wounds become instruments of understanding provided they have been integrated. Through counter-transference, the analyst's unconscious responds to the patient's material, often through emotion or imagery. If the analyst has confronted similar inner conflicts, they can interpret these responses as guidance from the self, enabling them to contain and mirror the patient's process. However, if the analyst's wounds remain unintegrated, counter-transference results in projection, boundary, confusion, or enactment. Thus, consciousness of one's wound transforms pathology into instrument. In Jung's model, the healer is not the ego but the self. Healing occurs when the ego allows itself to be acted upon by the self's compensatory wisdom. The wound, paradoxically, is the means by which this contact occurs. Pain dissolves ego inflation, making space for the self's emergence. Jung wrote that where there is a wound, there is a healing energy. This statement reflects his belief that psychic opposites coexist: destruction and renewal, suffering and transformation. The wound constellates the archetype of the healer, because both belong to the same psychic polarity. They are two expressions of the same archetypal pattern, the descent into the unconscious and the ascent into consciousness. From a structural standpoint, the wounded healer archetype represents the union of opposites, the healer, and the patient consciousness and unconsciousness, mortality and transcendence. Jung regarded such conjunctions as the essence of individuation. The ego must experience fragmentation to recognize its dependence on the self, just as the healer must experience helplessness to understand compassion. The transformation of pain into wisdom occurs when the ego ceases to resist suffering and instead enters into symbolic relationship with it. Suffering, when experienced consciously, becomes the opus of the soul, the alchemical work by which base matter, the raw wound, is transmuted into gold conscious understanding. Jung's alchemical studies illuminate this process further. In the alchemical metaphor, the nigredo corresponds to the wounded state, the dark night of despair, where meaning collapses. The albedo emerges when consciousness begins to illuminate the darkness, recognizing suffering as meaningful. Finally, the rubedo represents the synthesis of opposites, the healing that integrates both light and dark into a unified whole. The healer's power thus derives not from eliminating pain, but from sustaining consciousness within it. The capacity to endure paradox without retreat is what transforms wound into wisdom. The wounded healer archetype also embodies the dialectic of transference and countertransference central to Jung's clinical understanding of healing. In the analytic setting, the patient unconsciously projects inner images of the healer, parent, or savior onto the analyst, while the analyst's own unconscious responds in kind. Healing occurs not through the analyst technique, but through the mutual transformation of both participants as the archetype of the healer unfolds between them. Jung called this dynamic a two-person process in which both are caught in the same archetypal situation. The analyst's own healed wound serves as a vessel for the patient's projected suffering. The pain that once isolated the healer becomes the bridge of empathy. For women embodying this archetype, their intuitive and empathic sensitivity often exposes them to the psychic suffering of others. Their aura, already refined through individuation, functions as a mirror in which others perceive their own wounds. Jung would describe this as participation in the collective unconscious, the field where individual psyches intersect. The healer's task is to differentiate what belongs to herself from what belongs to others. The failure to do so leads to identificatory empathy, in which the healer absorbs collective pain without transformation. True healing requires symbolic consciousness, the ability to contain suffering as image rather than enactment. The wound also mediates the encounter with the shadow. Jung insisted that the healer must integrate personal shadow material before attempting to guide others. The unacknowledged shadow manifests as moral superiority, spiritual inflation, or unconscious manipulation. The wounded healer who denies her own darkness becomes dangerous, for she projects it onto those she seeks to help. Conversely, the healer who embraces her shadow becomes transparent to the healing power of the self. She recognizes that the capacity to heal does not originate from personal virtue, but from the psyche's natural drive toward wholeness. At a deeper level, the wounded healer archetype reveals the paradoxical unity of illness and cure within the psyche. Jung argued that neurosis itself is an attempt at self-healing. The illness is the attempt of the organism to restore balance. From this perspective, the wound is not merely the result of trauma, but the psyche's effort to individuate. Pain signals the need for reorganization. The healer archetype, when activated, translates this instinctive striving into conscious process. The individual becomes co-worker with the self in the work of transformation. This dynamic extends beyond psychotherapy into all human relationships. Every act of empathy, compassion, or guidance derives from the archetypal pattern of the wounded healer. The woman of high spiritual power embodies this principle not by choice, but by psychological destiny. Her wounds have forced her to relinquish identification with the ego and to live in relationship with the self. This relationship generates the numinous quality others perceive as healing presence. Her words or silence catalyze transformation because they carry the vibration of integration. Jung associated the activation of the healer archetype with the experience of numinosity, the sense of awe and sacredness that accompanies contact with the archetypal realm. When the wounded individual becomes aware that their suffering participates in a transpersonal pattern, the pain acquires meaning. Meaning for Jung is the fundamental factor in healing. The cure of the soul, he wrote, comes through the experience of meaning. The realization that one's wound serves the self's purpose transforms despair into reverence. The healer no longer asks, "Why did this happen to me?" but "What is being asked of me through this?" The process of transformation follows a cyclical rhythm of descent and return. The wound draws the ego downward into the unconscious, where it encounters chaos and dissolution. If the individual can sustain awareness in this descent, a new form of order emerges. Jung compared this movement to the mythic motif of the hero's journey into the underworld. The difference is that the wounded healer does not seek conquest but communion. Healing arises not from overcoming darkness but from relating to it. The ego learns to coexist with pain without identification. This capacity for symbolic suffering is the hallmark of maturity in Jung's system. The structural implication of the wounded healer archetype is the strengthening of the ego self-axis. The ego, having suffered and survived fragmentation, becomes flexible and resilient. It learns to trust the self's compensatory wisdom. This trust is the psychological equivalent of faith, not belief in external dogma, but confidence in the psyche's capacity for self-regulation. Jung described this as self-healing through self. The healer's authority thus derives not from knowledge or power, but from participation in the process of psychic self-regulation. The archetype also contains a collective dimension. Jung observed that when an individual integrates an archetypal pattern, it contributes to the evolution of collective consciousness. The woman who transforms her wound into awareness participates in the healing of cultural pathology. Her integration radiates into the collective psyche, where the same archetypal wounds, repression of feeling, fear of vulnerability, disconnection from instinct, are enacted on a societal scale. Her consciousness acts as a counterweight to collective shadow. In Jung's terms, she becomes a vessel for the objective psyche, allowing healing energy to flow into the world. Clinically, Jung recognized that the wounded healer dynamic operates in every therapeutic encounter. The analyst and patient both participate in a mutual process of individuation. Healing is not the transmission of health from one to another, but the co-creation of consciousness between two wounded beings. The analyst's task is not to fix, but to mirror, to bear witness to the patient's suffering as meaningful. This stance requires the analyst's own humility and continued self-analysis. Jung himself wrote that the doctor is effective only when he is affected. The healer's wound remains the source of authenticity. Without it, empathy degenerates into technique. In Jungian symbolism, the wound may also be understood as the site of transcendence. It is the place where the boundaries of ego are pierced, allowing contact with the numinous. The paradox is that the same vulnerability that exposes one to suffering also opens the channel to the self. The wound is therefore sacred. Jung's alchemical studies equated this with the vas hermeticum, the sealed vessel in which transformation occurs. The suffering ego contained within the psychic vessel undergoes purification through symbolic fire. Out of this process arises a new attitude, a consciousness capable of holding opposites without fragmentation. For the spiritually evolved woman, this means that her pain becomes the locus of meaning. Every wound she has suffered, emotional betrayal, loss, or alienation, becomes an initiation into deeper awareness. Her empathy, insight, and serenity are not gifts of temperament, but achievements of consciousness forged through suffering. The more profoundly she has suffered, the greater her capacity to contain others' suffering without collapse. She becomes, in Jung's words, a vessel filled with light because it has been hollowed by pain. The archetype also implies an ethical dimension. Jung stressed that the healer must continually renew contact with their own humanity. The danger of identifying with the healer role is inflation, the unconscious assumption of divine authority. The truly individuated healer knows that she is both wounded and healed, finite and infinite. Her authority rests on transparency, not perfection. She embodies the paradox that wholeness includes brokenness. This humility protects her from the dangers of archetypal possession and maintains the flow of healing energy through her rather than from her. Finally, the wounded healer archetype demonstrates Jung's central conviction that psyche and matter are aspects of one reality. The healing that occurs within the psyche manifests in the body, relationships, and world. The woman who integrates her wounds aligns herself with the unus mundus, the unified field of existence. Her pain becomes not a personal tragedy, but a contribution to the ongoing process of cosmic individuation, the evolution of consciousness through suffering. In this sense, to turn pain into power is not an act of will, but of surrender. The wound is not conquered, but consecrated. Through it, the human participates in the divine work of making the unconscious conscious. Part 6. The Divine Feminine Awakening, Reclaiming Sacred Power. In Jungian Analytical Psychology, the awakening of the feminine principle within the psyche represents a critical stage of individuation, the process by which consciousness integrates the totality of the self. Jung regarded the feminine not as a gendered attribute, but as a fundamental psychological principle, the principle of eros, which emphasizes relatedness, feeling, and wholeness. Its counterpart, logos, represents the masculine principle of discrimination, logic, and abstraction. The balance between eros and logos constitutes psychic health. The awakening of the divine feminine, therefore, is the re-emergence of the repressed eros principle into consciousness, restoring equilibrium within both the individual and the collective psyche. The repression of the feminine principle is not merely a cultural or historical phenomenon, it is a psychological one. Jung observed that Western consciousness, shaped by centuries of rationalism and patriarchy, had become one-sidedly identified with logos. This imbalance manifested in the collective psyche as alienation, fragmentation, and loss of meaning. The modern individual, dominated by intellect and technological abstraction, suffers from disconnection, from nature, from emotion, and from the symbolic life. The reawakening of the feminine principle signifies a compensatory movement of the unconscious, a return of the neglected eros seeking restoration of psychic wholeness. Jung viewed this as an inevitable process. When consciousness becomes lopsided, the unconscious compensates by producing the opposite. For women of high spiritual development, this compensation takes the form of an inner calling, a deep, non-rational movement of the psyche toward integration. The awakening is experienced not as an ideology, but as a transformation of consciousness. It involves the reintegration of the feeling function, the restoration of embodied awareness, and the recognition of relationship as sacred. The divine feminine in this context is not a deity, but a psychological reality, the return of the self through the medium of relatedness. Jung defined the self as the totality of conscious and unconscious elements of the psyche. The feminine awakening marks the stage where the self reclaims its emotional, intuitive, and somatic dimensions that were previously marginalized by the dominance of rational consciousness. Psychologically, this awakening corresponds to the integration of the anima, the inner feminine aspect present in both men and women. For women, the anima does not manifest as an opposite sex figure as it does for men, but as the deepening of their own feminine essence beyond personal identification. Jung described the anima as the archetype of life itself, mediating between the ego and the unconscious. In its integrated form, the anima functions as the guide to the self. The awakening of the feminine thus signifies the conscious alignment of the ego with this mediating function. The woman begins to live not from the demands of persona or collective expectation, but from the inner authority of the self. This process entails the differentiation of the feminine principle from its distorted expressions. When repressed, the feminine does not disappear. It sinks into the unconscious and manifests as emotional volatility, dependence, or victimization. Jung referred to such distortions as the negative anima complex, autonomous psychic structures that hijack energy from the ego. Integration transforms these patterns into their original life-giving form: receptivity without passivity, empathy without enmeshment, power without domination. The awakened feminine represents consciousness grounded in eros, an awareness that perceives through connection rather than control. Jung emphasized that individuation involves the reconciliation of opposites within the psyche. The awakening of the divine feminine, therefore, does not reject logos but integrates it. The task is not to replace the masculine principle but to balance it. When the feminine awakens, it does not destroy rationality, it humanizes it. Feeling becomes the corrective to thinking relatedness, the complement to abstraction. Jung insisted that consciousness requires polarity to maintain vitality. The union of eros and logos mirrors the alchemical conjunctio oppositorum, the sacred marriage of opposites within the psyche that produces the self as the transcendent synthesis. From a developmental standpoint, the awakening of the feminine follows earlier stages of individuation. After the confrontation with the shadow and the integration of the wounded aspects of self, the psyche is prepared to encounter the deeper transpersonal dimension of the feminine principle. Jung regarded this as an emergence of the archetype of the self in feminine form. The self presents itself symbolically according to the individual's orientation. In women, it often appears as an image of inner wholeness, a mandala, a maternal figure, or an inner voice of wisdom. This emergence signals the movement of the unconscious toward conscious participation in the creative principle of life. The transformation is both intrapsychic and interpersonal. As the feminine principle awakens, the woman's perception of relationship changes fundamentally. Relationship ceases to be an exchange of needs and becomes a field of mutual individuation. Jung observed that the principle of eros unites what is separated. The awakened feminine operates through empathy, resonance, and inclusion. It recognizes that psychological boundaries do not separate but define points of contact. In this way, the woman becomes a vessel of integration within her environment, capable of mediating between opposing energies, between mind and body, self and other, inner and outer. At the structural level, the awakening of the feminine reorganizes the psyche around a new center of gravity. The ego, which once ruled through control and defense, yields to the organizing power of the self. Jung likened this reorientation to a planetary system in which the sun, self, replaces the ego as the central source of light. The feminine principle facilitates this shift because it operates through surrender rather than assertion. Surrender in this context is not weakness, but alignment with the self's teleological movement. The woman ceases to impose will upon life and begins to participate in its unfolding. This attitude of participation corresponds to Jung's notion of synchronicity, the meaningful connection between inner and outer events. The awakened feminine perceives the symbolic correspondence of psyche and world. Events are no longer interpreted merely as causally determined, but as expressions of a deeper order. The feeling function, now integrated, provides the capacity to discern meaning in experience. Jung considered meaning the central requirement of psychic health. The psyche suffers when life is experienced as meaningless. The restoration of the feminine principle thus restores meaning by reconnecting consciousness with the symbolic dimension of existence. The awakening of the feminine also restores the sacredness of embodiment. Jung's psychology, though spiritual in scope, never denied the body. He regarded the psyche as psychoid, a continuum of mind and matter. The repression of the feminine had alienated consciousness from its bodily roots. The re-emergence of eros reunites psyche with soma. The woman begins to experience intuition not as abstract insight but as embodied knowing. Her awareness expands downward into the physical and emotional layers of being. Jung would describe this as the integration of the instinctual psyche, the recovery of the natural rhythms of life that had been subordinated to the intellect. Another aspect of the awakening is the transformation of value orientation. Jung contrasted thinking types who orient by truth with feeling types who orient by value. The dominance of thinking in Western culture led to the devaluation of subjective experience. The reawakening of the feminine reestablishes feeling as an organ of evaluation. Value is no longer determined by utility or logic, but by authenticity and resonance with the self. The awakened feminine measures life by depth, not height, by connection, not conquest. This revaluation of values marks a fundamental shift in consciousness from domination to participation, from hierarchy to reciprocity. The process also entails confrontation with collective resistance. Jung was acutely aware that the feminine principle, when emerging in an individual, challenges the cultural status quo. The collective psyche, invested in the old order of logos dominance, reacts defensively. The woman experiencing this awakening may encounter misunderstanding, projection, or hostility from her environment. Jung described this as the enantiodromia of consciousness, the reversal of direction when an extreme has been reached. Individuation always requires a certain estrangement from the collective. The woman must endure the loneliness of standing between worlds, no longer identified with the old consciousness, not yet fully integrated into the new. This transitional phase parallels the alchemical nigredo, a descent into uncertainty preceding illumination. Within the psyche, this resistance manifests as internal conflict. The ego fears dissolution in the face of the self's vastness. The feminine awakening demands relinquishment of control, which the ego experiences as death. Jung insisted that this symbolic death is necessary. There is no rebirth without death. The surrender of ego sovereignty allows the self to become the new center of authority. The woman who submits to this process undergoes transformation from a fragmented personality to an integrated individual. Her consciousness expands to include paradox and complexity. She no longer seeks certainty but wholeness. The psychological hallmark of the awakened feminine is relatedness. This does not mean dependency, but conscious interconnection. Jung described Eros as the principle that perceives the invisible web of relationship among all things. The awakened woman perceives life symbolically. Every encounter reflects an aspect of her inner world. Her empathy extends beyond personal sentiment to ontological recognition. She senses the unity of psyche and cosmos. Yet this recognition does not lead to dissolution. It coexists with clear individuation. Relatedness without differentiation becomes fusion. Differentiation without relatedness becomes isolation. The feminine principle holds the tension between these poles, maintaining dynamic equilibrium. From the standpoint of psychic structure, this integration produces harmony among the psychological functions. Intuition and feeling, the natural expressions of Eros, cooperate with thinking and sensation rather than opposing them. The woman's cognition becomes holistic, simultaneously rational and intuitive, analytical and empathetic. Jung termed this the transcendent function in operation, the emergence of a third attitude that transcends opposition. The awakened feminine embodies this function at the level of consciousness itself, reconciling spirit and matter, thought and emotion, individual and collective. The emergence of the feminine principle also redefines the meaning of power. In patriarchal consciousness, power is equated with control, assertion, and hierarchy. In Jungian terms, this corresponds to ego-dominant logos. The feminine principle introduces a different paradigm: power as receptivity, presence, and influence through resonance. Jung recognized this form of power in the archetypal function of the self, which operates not by coercion, but by attraction. The self draws the ego into alignment through symbolic meaning and synchronicity. The awakened woman, reflecting this dynamic, influences others not by force but by coherence. Her power is the natural gravitation of wholeness. This transformation culminates in what Jung called psychological wholeness, the state in which all opposites within the psyche are integrated around the self. The divine feminine awakening is therefore not an addition to consciousness, but a recentering of it. The woman becomes transparent to the self's purpose. Her life expresses archetypal meaning without conscious effort. Jung described such individuals as individuated personalities, those who live from the inner law of their being rather than external conformity. Their influence is numinous because they embody the self's energy in human form. Clinically, the integration of the feminine principle manifests as emotional stability, authenticity, and creative vitality. The individual no longer represses feeling or intuition but uses them as instruments of understanding. The psyche achieves dynamic balance between differentiation and unity. Jung's concept of self-regulation of the psyche finds full expression here. Unconscious compensations no longer erupt as symptoms because consciousness attends to their messages symbolically. The woman's awareness becomes participatory rather than defensive. She listens to the unconscious as partner rather than adversary. In the collective dimension, the awakening of the feminine contributes to the evolution of culture. Jung believed that individual individuation is the smallest unit of collective transformation. The reintegration of eros within individual psyches gradually alters the collective attitude toward relationship, emotion, and meaning. The return of the feminine principle counterbalances the destructive excesses of logos, dominance, rationalism, materialism, and alienation. The emergence of empathy, cooperation, and symbolic thinking in cultural consciousness signals the collective individuation of humanity itself. From the viewpoint of depth psychology, the divine feminine awakening represents the completion of the individuation cycle. The earlier stages encounter with the shadow integration of the unconscious reconciliation of opposites prepare the psyche for union with the self. The feminine principle as the mediating force of eros enables this union by dissolving separation between ego and self without erasing differentiation. The ego becomes the conscious instrument of the self's creative intelligence. Jung described this state as living the symbolic life in which every experience is perceived as meaningful manifestation of the inner order. Thus, the awakening of the divine feminine is the psychological restoration of wholeness through the re-emergence of eros. It is not a cultural revolution, but a psychic evolution. The woman who embodies it does not strive for superiority, but for integration. Her consciousness reconciles thought and feeling autonomy and communion strength and tenderness. In Jungian terms, she has realized the self, the totality of her being. The sacred power she reclaims is the inherent power of consciousness aligned with the deeper order of the psyche. Through her, the divine becomes conscious in matter, and the psyche fulfills its timeless aim to know itself. Spiritual power does not come from perfection, it comes from integration. Every shadow faced, every wound endured, and every silence accepted becomes light condensed into wisdom. Jung believed that when a woman unites her conscious and unconscious selves, she does not become supernatural, she becomes fully human. The divine feminine awakening is not the creation of something new, but the remembrance of what was never lost.